Welcome to A Pair of Bookends, the book club you can carry anywhere. I'm your host, Hannah MacDonald, and I'll be bookending the conversation with some of the most exciting voices from the bookish world. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Sam Taylor. Sam is a novelist and literary translator based in the United States. He began his career as a journalist at The Observer before moving to France, where he wrote 4 novels, learnt French, and started a family. He has translated more than 70 books from French, and his award-winning translations include works by Laurent Binet, Leila Slimani, and Marcel Proust. His latest book, The Two Loves of Sophie Strom, is out now and published by Faber. Welcome, Sam, to A Pair of Bookends.
Thank you, Hannah.
Thank you for coming on. I am really excited to chat to you, and I've already told you how much I loved your book. As I said to you before, it's beautiful. I finished it last night and it has left me bereft. It's such a beautiful story, and we will get on to that. But before we start, I have to ask you what you're currently reading.
Okay, well, I finished a couple of novels yesterday, in fact. So one of them was Philip Kerr, Prague Fatale, which is like, I think it's the 9th book in his Bernie Gunther detective series.
Oh, wow.
Have you ever read him?
No.
Yeah, Bernie Gunther is a detective, private detective, originally in the Third Reich in Nazi Berlin, and then he goes to Austria. This one's set in Czechoslovakia. It's like a lot of it's around Second World War, some of it's after the Second World War. It's kind of genre in the sense that they are actual detective stories, but or kind of noir detective stories, but they're really well written, and the history is fascinating, and it's great, really, really interesting. And the other novel I finished yesterday was Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell.
I have still not got to this. How was it?
That's the second time I read it. The first time I read it, I enjoyed it, but I think I was dreading the inevitable. Do you know the story?
Not very well, no.
Okay, well, it's based on history, so it's not really a spoiler to say that
Yeah, of course.
it's Hamlet who dies at the age of
Yes.
11. So like, I was kind of like dreading that event all the way through reading it,
Yeah.
and I've enjoyed it less because of that. And so I reread it to like pay more attention to the language and the way it was written, and it is really beautiful. It's an amazing book. It's also kind of related to the novel I'm writing now, which is set 20 years later in England, 1620s. And yeah, I really like historical novels set in that period that don't use like thee and thou and make everything ye olde worldy, you know. And this is a very making the past feel real, but also kind of not making it feel distant and obscure. So,
But this is the thing,
really enjoyed
because
that.
I am not the biggest fan of, I say that's a lie. I always thought I wasn't the biggest fan of historical novels and wouldn't reach for them. I always thought that I'd feel stupid reading them because of some of the language that might be used, or like the terminology. I thought I wouldn't understand things. And then through the podcast, I've been pushed to read outside of my little sort of contemporary fiction bubble, and have been sort of drawn to read other genres. And all the historical novels I've read so far, I've been like, why? I've been missing out so much, because there's so much great stuff out there. And your book especially, it felt so present, even though it wasn't, which I don't know how you managed to do that.
I mean, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted. I mean, I didn't set out to write a historical novel. What I set out to write was essentially the story of the boy whose life splits in two. So you get like this sliding doors, but they dream about each other. And I originally wrote that as a science fiction novel like 14 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I ended up setting it in the real world because all the feedback I got about that novel was that this one idea was so strong, I should focus on that and take away all the other non-real stuff around it, basically, to make it more grounded. And I ended up doing that and set it in the Second World War, or before and during the Second World War, just because that gave me the best setting for the contrast of the two lives.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I was in love with the Second World War or anything like that. It wasn't like I was setting out to write a historical novel, but I'm a bit like you. I used to kind of be wary of historical fiction.
Yeah.
For the same reason, a lot of it seemed distant, but there's a few books that I read that were historical fiction that felt exactly like you described, and they felt extremely present. There's some books about the Roman Empire by Alan Massey. This was the first one I read. Hilary Mantel's first historical novel, not the ones before Wolf Hall. She wrote a book called A Place of Greater Safety about the French Revolution, which is my favorite of all her books. And again, it's just like you're inside the heads of these people who are in the middle of all this turmoil that was happening. And I'm trying to think what was the other one I was going to mention. I mean, Maggie O'Farrell again is similar in that. And yeah, what it comes down to, I think, is that people in the past weren't in the past for
Yeah.
themselves.
Yes, of
They were
course, yeah.
at the tip of the spear, just like we are, and it felt like they were absolutely on the edge of the future
Hmm.
and uncertain, and no one knew what was going to happen next. And I don't really think people change that much over time. You know, it's like if you read like first person primary sources from way back, you know, even 2000 years back, they're talking about the same things, the same emotions, the same dilemmas, the same desires as we feel now. I don't think
Yeah.
anything really changes with human beings that much. So yeah, that's how I think about writing fiction when I'm writing in the past. It's no different from writing in the future, except that it's just the setting around it, which is different.
I do think though that it is a real talent to be able to make historical fiction feel like you're like I was immediately immersed in the world of this book. So we should probably tell the listeners what this book is about. So I'm gonna hand that over to you. What is your sort of elevator pitch for this book?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have one. I've tried doing this several times.
I'm
But
sorry.
line summary. Okay, so it begins in Vienna in 1933, and the protagonist is a 13-year-old boy called Max Spiegelman. He has a Jewish father and a Catholic mother, and one night his parents' house is set on fire by young Nazis. And then the book splits in two. His life splits in two. In one version of his life, his parents are killed in the house fire. He survives and is adopted by an Aryan couple who live nearby, and he ends up joining the Hitler Youth, becoming a member of the SS, and going to France when the Germans invade France, going to Paris, where the second part of the book is set. In the other version of his life, he wakes from a dream about escaping from the fire, knows that the fire is happening, is able to save his parents, and grows up a Jewish boy, labeled as a Jewish boy in Nazi, what becomes Nazi Austria, and ends up going to Paris because the girl he loves is there and joins the French resistance. And so he and his alter ego, who has been renamed Hans, are fighting on opposite sides of the war, but in parallel universes. They have no contact with each other except that they dream about each other. So it's sliding doors with a twist that they are aware of each other's lives and thoughts, and it's like when they're asleep, they are the other person. They go through exactly what that person's going through. So they know way more about what it's like to be on the other side than anybody else.
I mean, it's incredibly ambitious, but it's executed so wonderfully and brilliantly. And I was really curious actually, when you were writing this book, what kind of took you by surprise from what you had originally set out to write?
I think the character of Sophie more than anything. I think in the first draft of the book, she was just a character. She was like the love interest for Hans and Max. And I think I did 5 drafts in the end. In each draft, her voice grew stronger and she became a bigger part of the book and she became more just her own person. And I think writing the letters, there's a series of letters from Sophie to Max and from Sophie to Hans when she moves to Paris before they do. And that's when she kind of came alive for me because I was writing from her viewpoint. So.
Why did you want the letters to feature? Was that something specific to Sophie's character that helped you sort of flesh her out?
I mean, that's what it became. I think originally I had the letters as a bridge between the two because what the first part of the book ends in 1938 and the second part begins in 1940, and it was a way of showing what happened to her and what happened to their relationships in the time between that. So
Hmm.
because she was in Paris in 1934, so it's like there's like a 6 year gap where they're not together. And yeah, it was designed as a bridge, but it became kind of more than that. It became a beginning of her voice, her personality, I think.
I really enjoyed reading the letters because I feel like it's such a lost form of it is a lost form of contact now, isn't it? But I think it's such a beautiful thing, and I really wish sometimes that we could still have letters and write letters to people. I mean, you could, but it just feels sort of redundant now, and it's such a shame because it's such a beautiful way of speaking to people and sort of waiting to receive that. It's such a nice thing.
I
Um,
agree. Yeah, in fact, I've just translated, or I've translated one novel, which is an epistolary novel,
yeah.
and I'm writing another one, which is as well. And yeah, I love the form as well. I wrote loads of letters when I was in my teens and early 20s. So this is back in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
You still did that. You're probably too young to remember
No, I
them.
mean, I was born in the 90s, but I remember when I went on holidays with my family, I would write letters to the other kids that I met on holiday. And then it sort of died out. I kind of, my childhood went from very quickly from communicating with people I'd met on holiday through letters, and then very quickly we had the internet and it sort of died off. So I sort of missed that just slightly, but I still got to experience a little bit of it, which was nice. I wanted to ask as well, and you did mention it before about this book start. I think you said it started for you 14 years ago. I read in your acknowledgements that it took between 10 and 14 years, so I don't know what the correct number is. But how did you manage to keep yourself motivated during that period of time?
Okay, well, I wasn't writing it for. I mean, it's 12 years is what I said in the acknowledgements,
Yeah.
and that's the time that it took from the first draft of the science fiction novel to the final draft of Two Loves of Sophie Strom. But I wasn't writing for 12 years. I wrote two drafts of the science fiction novel, and then my life was kind of turned upside down because, well, two things. One, I realized I couldn't make enough money from writing anymore, and I had to find some other work. Considering I was living in the middle of nowhere in France and had no other skills, was kind of not straightforward.
Mm.
Although realizing, hey, I could speak French now, but I'll be trying to become a translator. So I kind of got very lucky with literary translation. The first book I was asked to read for a publisher was HHHH by Laurent Binet, which was the best book I'd read in like 10 years, and which I ended up translating and became kind of like it wasn't a bestseller, but it was like a big critical success.
Hmm.
And as a translator. So that was part of the reason. So yeah, I became a translator, and at the same time, I fell in love. I was married to someone else, not a happy marriage, and I fell in love with this woman who was living in America, who also was in a not very happy marriage. And I mean, she started off, she read my books and wrote to me, and just became started corresponding, became friends, and then realized we both fall in love. And so it was all very kind of life changing. And so I got divorced. I moved to America. I got remarried. I had another child. And at the same time, I was trying to make a living as a translator so I could like go back and forth and be with my kids in France. And so, yeah, I had no time to write anything during that period. And that novel, the science fiction novel, just got put in a drawer. And like 4 or 5 years later, when things had settled down a bit more, I started writing another novel because I thought that one just I'd kind of more or less forgotten about it really. The other novel didn't work out, it got too complicated. And I ended up going back to that one because I had a friend who he'd actually bought the film rights to my third novel. That's how he became my friend. And then he gave up filmmaking, but he was asking about this novel that I'd written in 2010, the science fiction book, and he read it and said, "This is really good. You should definitely do something with this." So I read it again and thought about it and thought about everyone saying it should be set in the real world. And finally, after about 6 years after I'd started it, I had an idea where I could set it in the real world. It just didn't seem I couldn't work out how to do it before. And then I was just driving my kids to school one day, like a 45-minute drive, different places, and had this idea and sat down and wrote like a plan, and that was the Two Loves of Sophie Strong, basically. So
Wow.
and the next 6 years, which was like, it used to take me 2 years to write a novel because that's all I was doing. But I was also translating like 5 to 10 books a year while this was going
Wow.
on. I was writing in the gaps between translations, basically. So it took me 5 drafts and 6 years. And the good thing about that was that the long time between each draft meant I had more objectivity when I reread it.
Hmm.
And it also meant I was making so many changes each time that I didn't get bored with the book. It's like usually by this point, when it's been published, I kind of hate the books that I've written. It's like I'm so sick of them. And this one, I'm not. I still like it because it's like it changed so much over time, and I had all these periods in between when I wasn't thinking about it. So it's been a good way to work. In fact, sorry, I kept that one.
No, not at all. I love hearing about all of this. I mean, I've got a few things to say off what you've just said. One of them is that I feel like I want to read the novel of you falling in love with your wife because that's a beautiful story. And
There's a lot of her in Sophie. I mean, there are elements from real life in the novel you just read. I mean, the dream that Sophie
that, I
has.
mean, that makes a lot of sense because Sophie is a character that I fell completely in love with. I was like, I want to be with Sophie. She's such a beautiful character. And, she does she's sort of the light in this very dark tunnel for both of these characters, isn't she? And I feel like, is that the element that you were recreating from your wife?
I mean, there's a lot of little things, a lot of little details, and yeah, I think it's quite a romantic book in a way,
Very romantic.
more than my other books, I think, and that's just because I'd fallen in love for the second time in my life. The first time was kind of unrequited, got my heart broken, and so this was like the first time of actually really experiencing love, and it's like yeah, it was amazing. It changed my life, and it's like so that's definitely kind of central to the novel, I think.
That you can definitely get a sense of that. So that's really beautiful that you're experiencing that yourself. I also wanted to ask, just because you were talking about your friend that's a filmmaker, this book felt very cinematic. Are there any plans on the horizon? I'm not sure if there are, if you'd be allowed to say anything, but are there any plans in the pipeline for this book to be adapted?
I mean, I hope it happens. Nobody's talking about it yet. I mean, I've written 5 novels. The first four, two of them were I sold the option. One of them was actually made into a film, which I hated, but there you go.
Oh,
The second one was made into a screenplay or several screenplays that I really liked, but never made into a film. So it's perfectly possible it'll get optioned. I have no idea, but yeah, it's I've got to wait for that to happen.
I'd be
So,
very surprised if it wasn't optioned because I feel like there's so much in there, and I'm an actor, and I feel like a role in something like this would be an absolute dream. It is such a gorgeous story. So if anybody's listening that can make this happen, please do.
yeah, that would be great. Yeah. I agree. I mean, like the Max and Hans is a fantastic role because it's like one actor playing two completely different characters.
Yes, incredible. It would be such a phenomenal role. I wanted to ask actually about Max and Hans because I want to know what was it like to create their dynamic and to have them having this sort of ongoing dialogue between them.
What was it like? It was fascinating. I think Hans was the one who took longer to come into focus for me. It's like his character went through more changes than Max's. I think originally he was less sympathetic, like more of a Nazi, and because part of the idea of the book is something that's kind of mentioned in one of the conversations between the characters, is the idea that not all the Nazis were evil people. I cannot believe that an entire generation of one country, everyone was just evil. I don't
Hmm.
buy it. So I think so much of what people become is down to environment, upbringing, what they're surrounded by, chance, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, this book was kind of a thought experiment at the start in terms of how one person can end up in two different, completely different sides in what seems like a good and evil conflict, but I don't think it's that simple. So I kind of wanted to make him very dark at first, but then it became more difficult to believe in his relationship with Sophie and why would she like him if he was like that. And so it was like so it was much more he became I think more relatable, more likable as the drafts changed him. He became more because the thing is he's aware of what Max is going through his dreams. So he has more empathy than everyone around him in his milieu. Everyone, all the other Nazis, he knows what the effects of this are, and it's the empathy that makes him more resistant to it, I think. So
What was it like in terms of creating Hans' character? Because, like you said, he is a Nazi, and but that's not how his life sort of starts out. This isn't the immediate trajectory of his life. And it was really interesting because you do toy with this idea of the butterfly effect and how, specific choices or specific things that happen to us. I feel like I'm going to explain the butterfly effect really badly, but how, one choice can sort of lead on to another and so on. And I was wondering, especially because I feel like we live in an age of social media now where a lot of conversations and discourse are kind of lacking nuance. And like you just said then, like you don't believe that all this generation of Nazis were all evil people. And you're right. Like they wouldn't have all been evil people. Some of them would have had to make a choice because of, their life or their family's life depended on it. We don't know. So what was it like to write him as a Nazi, and how much research did you have to do around that?
I mean, I read a lot of books, but I don't think that's the crux of getting into the head of someone in that situation. I think it's more just an imaginative leap.
Yeah.
And that's what I find fascinating about writing. That's what I enjoy most about it. It's the ability to kind of inhabit other times, other places, other people.
Hmm.
because obviously you only have one life. Well, okay, I believe you only have one life, and I'd love to kind of experience way more than I possibly can in one lifetime, and writing is a way of doing that. Yeah, I mean, I did do a lot of research. I don't know how many books I read in the end, but a lot of history books, a lot of fiction written at the time, a lot of psychology books. But yeah, I do think ultimately you can read everything, and then my idea was I took a lot of notes as well, but I think the first draft had so much historical detail in it that it just overwhelmed the whole story.
Hmm.
So I basically cut it all out and only used the stuff I'd learned when it kind of came up in the story. Basically, I didn't want it to be, I've done lots of research and I've written a historical novel. That wasn't what I was aiming for. So I didn't want it to impede the flow of the story at all. Yeah, like I said, it's more about the imaginative leap of just being on the other side of something than it is about however much you can research it. And I guess, I mean, if you're an actor, I assume you do this anyway. It's like you have to get yourself into someone else's head and
Hmm.
see the world through. That's what it came down to. I think it's kind of like method writing, I suppose. It's like just seeing the same events and the same people and the same feeling the same emotions, but through on the other side of the divide. So
I wanted to ask as well about music because that is something that features a lot, like quite heavily in the book. Why do you think music is so important to these characters? Why do you think they're so connected to music?
I'm probably because I am, I suppose. Mean, I was a huge music fan as a kid. I ended up becoming a music writer at The Observer and various magazines when I was in my 20s. My music was more kind of post-punk
Right.
rock music and stuff rather than classical music. And I've never been able to play an instrument. So I kind of giving Max and Hans the ability to play an instrument well was really satisfying. It's like I could do it even though I can't. And yeah, I think it's kind of unifying. I think there's something about music as there is about love. Anything that people are passionate about and does not in itself divide, I think yeah, music is one of the themes running through the book that kind of brings people together in that way. But
I mean, any sort of story that features the Nazis or this sort of difficult part of history, it has the potential to be quite bleak and quite violent and upsetting. But that wasn't the case with this book. Yes, there was really moving parts to it, and deeply unsettling things that happen with them. But it feels like a very hopeful book. Did you realize when writing it that hope would feature so much or that it would be a very hopeful book?
that's a really good question. I'm trying to remember like the first draft of the science fiction novel where had a hopeful ending. I think it didn't really. I think it was much more. Yeah, I think the hope came through probably what I went through before I wrote the historical version.
Hmm.
Years where I changed my life and everything. I think love is in itself hopeful,
For
and I think
sure.
hope comes. You tend not to be hopeful if everything's great and you're happy. You don't need to
Yeah.
be hopeful. Hope is like a consequence of darkness, of going through tough times, and so yeah, it's like I think it was something that developed as the novel was written and felt kind of hard earned in the end. It's like you when I put them through everything they went through, they
Mhm.
deserve hope at the end. So,
For sure, yeah. And I do think that Sophie as a character provides a lot of hope for both Max and Hans. And I think music as well does give this sort of like music is this positive force for them as well. So I think, yeah, it was really beautiful the way that you wrote about music. And again, I will mention Sophie, the way that you wrote about her, because I do think that those things were the real light in the darkness. So yeah, I just want to say I really enjoyed that those elements of the book.
you're much better at speaking about it than I am, so you should probably just.
Yeah, I don't know. I wanted to ask actually about you have obviously mentioned about your work as a translator, but I was really curious in terms of the processes between the two. What are the sort of big differences between your practice as a translator, which I have no experience with, so please tell me, and your process as a writer?
I mean,
I mean, you're
translation
writing for both, so I don't know how
exactly.
best to word that, but
It's absolutely, you're right. Translation is writing, and for me, it's writing in English, which I think is the most important aspect of translation. I think a lot of people assume that you have to be kind of the most important part is being fluent in another language, and that definitely helps. But I don't think that makes you a good translator. I think what makes you a good translator is being able to write well in your target language, the language that you're native in and that you are writing into. And in my case, that's English. So I do feel like, I mean, I had no training in translation whatsoever. I never even studied French in school. I mean, I moved to France not speaking a word of it, learned just from being there for so long, mostly learned from playing football and tennis, just like I was playing with. So yeah, I became kind of fluent in French just from living in France. And the difference in the process of writing and translation. I mean, translation is you're writing a book from beginning to end, but you don't have to create any of it. Or the only thing you're creating is the words. So every word in every book I've translated is mine, but the story is not mine. The characters are not mine. The setting isn't mine. The themes, the source of inspiration for it, all of that stuff is somebody else's. And basically, it's like you're following train tracks. It's much simpler than writing. It's tiring. It's hard work. It's interesting work. There is a creative aspect to it, but there are literary translators who claim that translating a book is the equal of writing a book, and I think anyone who's actually written a book wouldn't. Anyone who's done both would not agree with that.
Mhm.
For 100,000 word book, even if I wasn't okay, this one took a long time, but the other ones I wrote took me 2 years to write a 100,000 word book. To translate a 100,000 word book takes me 6 weeks. So it's a much smaller
Yeah.
amount of time, a much smaller amount of effort, but it's a good thing to combine with writing. I find it very like I find writing more thrilling, but it's
Mhm.
also kind of more up and down, more high risk. You can take a wrong turn and go completely off track and get lost and feel terrible about it. And translation, you can't do that. It's just you're just following what's already been written. All the decisions have been made for you. So all the big decisions you have to, the micro decisions about choice of words and sentence structure and all that kind of stuff is what you're working on. And I translate very quickly. I do kind of 45-minute sessions and I translate 1,000 words in 45 minutes. Depends on
Wow.
the sometimes it's less than that, sometimes it's more than that, but about that. And yeah, I did that initially because I was translating not novels. I was translating just commercial stuff just to earn money. I translated my first novel in 2010 and it was published in 2012. And between those 2 years, I had no other literary translation work coming in. So I basically just translated for agencies. And to make a living doing that, to meet their deadlines, you basically have to translate 4,000 words a day. So I got used to that pace. And now I can't translate slowly. I can't, even if I try to slow down, I can't do it. It's like I lose my, it's like riding a bike. If you ride a bike too slow, you just fall off the bike. So
Mhm.
I have to do it at that speed to concentrate that fully. So yeah, with translation, I do a time session and then I completely switch off and do other stuff for an hour or something. With writing, I don't do that. I just write until I finish the scene or whatever. And I kind of look up in a daze and realize that, the hours have just disappeared. I've vanished. So they're very different experiences. But I do think, like I said before, having that gap between drafts, having that kind of like doing something else that is creative but not demanding in the same way is a good way of breaking up writing and making it like I appreciate it so much more than I used to.
Mhm.
I think I was writing full time. It felt I still enjoyed it, but it was more like a job. It felt more like gotta write today. Whereas now it's kind of like I get to write today. It's like
Oh, that's nice. Do you think that working as a translator has changed the way you approach your own like writing your novels?
I think the biggest change is just what I described. It's more in terms of like how I feel about it. It
Yeah,
it, it
the excitement.
feels more like a holiday or something. It's like a treat. I'm sure I've picked up things up over the years from being inside so many other writers' voices. It's like maybe it's a bit like acting in terms of you're interpreting a role in different ways.
Mm.
So yeah, it's like I've definitely picked up not tricks exactly, but like I see. I've said in an interview recently that translating his book is like X-raying it. So you kind of like you get into the sentences in a deeper way than you would just from reading it, and it allows you to understand how the book is put together in a sentence by sentence way, and in terms of voices and how the voice is constructed. So it's definitely been it's like it hasn't fundamentally changed the way I write, but it's kind of like built up my writing muscle or something. I think it's like
Mm.
giving me more strength, more resources.
I think the interview that you just mentioned was for The Guardian. I think I read that the other day, and it's a really great interview. So I'll link that in the show notes so that other listeners can have a read of that as well, because I thought it was really fascinating. But obviously, I needed to ask you about your work as a translator because I am just so fascinated by it, and I just think it's a really wonderful thing, and I'm really pleased that we're hearing a lot more about translators now, and we're seeing their names on the covers of books, and it feels like that is a thing that should be celebrated also.
Do you read much translated fiction? Just out of interest.
I try to. I've definitely started to read more of it in the last couple of years, but I don't know if it was something that I always thought about, that I was missing picking up those books. It wasn't something that I was like, oh, I'm actually not reading enough of that. Whereas now I'm a lot more conscious of it. And I think it's through doing the podcast and through I have like an Instagram that's dedicated to books, and I review books on there, and it you sort of start to become conscious of the things that you're missing out on books wise when you're in a community of people that are reading lots of things, and you go, actually, I've not tried that yet. There's definitely a lot more that I need to get to. So
But to me, it's important that people don't think of it as like a chore or something. It's like I
no,
think there is.
not at all. Please don't think that's what I meant. No, that's really not what I
No,
meant.
I wasn't saying it about you. It's like I do think there is this tendency to think of translated literature as being like the brown rice of literature. It's like it's good for you, but it's
Of
not much.
course. Oh no,
Um,
sorry, I thought you meant it's good for you to read that. It's not, of course.
no, okay, for me, it's like they're just stories. They're just stories that happen to be written in other languages that you wouldn't be able to read if they hadn't been written. So
Yeah,
I don't think it has to be like intellectual or worthy, or they can just be funny, or they could be exciting. They can be anything, just like English literature can be anything.
yeah,
I tend to I'll resist the idea that translation is kind of worthy and earnest and important and all this sort of stuff. I just think it's just opening up more possibilities, basically. So you might not have a chance to read otherwise. So.
yeah, that's true. I would like to ask, before I ask for the recommendation and have to let you go, I would like to ask if you could share any influences that helped you with writing The Two Loves of Sophie Strom, whether that be literary or otherwise.
Oh wow, okay. Literary, I would say that the biggest influences. Okay, what I really like in literature is, I mean, this sounds really basic, but it's actually fairly unusual. It's like a really good story that's also well written. It's like basically you're talking about literary fiction tends to be really well written, but not that much in terms of story. And commercial fiction tends to have really good stories, but be kind of blandly written or have like flat characters and stuff. So what I like is the sweet spot in between those
Mhm.
things where it's both. And what I also like is like I enjoy fantasy. I enjoy George R. R. Martin, for example, but I find when there's too much fantasy, it's just like it just feels less real. Not with his work, but with a lot of it. And so what I like best is novels that are set in the real world, but have something kind of magical or impossible about them. So among the novels that influence this one, not directly, but just in those terms, are Life After Life by Kate Atkinson.
Which I've still not read. So I'm adding that to my list.
The Time Traveler's Wife by Audrey Niffenegger,
Beautiful.
which a lot of people hate, but I still absolutely love. I'm trying to think of the name of the. I'm really bad at remembering names. The book about the two magicians. Have you read that? The long fantasy novel about the two magicians. I really should just remember the name of this book. Like that much. I feel like feels like you should do a better job. Okay, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by
Oh, of
Suzanne.
course.
Okay, I absolutely loved that, and Piranesi as well was fantastic. But
Piranesi was so great.
And yeah, other books that were kind of touchstones for me when I was when I was writing this book, not in terms of subject matter or style or anything, just books that I loved reading and kept going back to. The Secret History for me is just like one of those that I cannot stop. Every time I read a passage of it, just to kind of remember what it is that I liked about it so much, I just end up reading the entire book again. So I've read that book more than any other book in my
I
life.
feel like everybody says The Secret History is a book that they reread.
Really? Okay, I haven't.
Yeah.
There must be something about it. It's
I think
just
it's Donna Tartt. Everybody just, I don't, I've not heard anybody say a bad word about Donna Tartt.
I don't feel the same way about our other books though. There's
Oh,
only
that's
one.
interesting.
Yeah, I've never reread either of the other two.
So, last but not least, I would love to hear some recommendations that you might be able to give the listeners. So, could you tell me what you'd like to recommend?
Yes, I read three novels last summer, all in a row, that I absolutely loved. And all three of them, I kind of felt like I was living in the book, which is, like the ultimate compliment, I think. Okay, the first one was Burnham Wood by Eleanor Catton, which is kind of like an echo thriller in a way, but just very gripping and very real feeling with lots of very current themes going on. It felt very, yeah, very now. The Guest by Emma Cline.
It's on my shelf. I can't wait to get
Oh
to it.
yeah, really a summer. It's definitely a summer book. I loved the uncertainty of that. It's just like from the first page, you're just kind of in this character's head, and you kind of she's just like a loose cannon, and you don't know what she's going to do next, and you're kind of dreading it, and but it's funny at the same time. Yeah, that is a brilliant book. And the third one was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
Again, I've not got to it yet.
Well, you got a treat ahead of you. I wish I hadn't read them
That's
yet.
going to be those two for my summer reads for sure.
Yeah, again, that was it's unusual for me in the sense that it's like it didn't really have a plot and nothing magical happened. It was all about the relationship between the two main characters, and I'm not interested in video games at all. I've never played video games, but it was like it treated making video games the same way. It felt like any art basically. So I always like reading about writers or artists or any kind of creative endeavor like that, just because I find creating stuff so it's so exciting. It's like
Mhm.
spark you get from it. I used to write poetry when I was a kid, and I make cocktails now, and like the same, I get the same spark from both of those. It's like when you create something that's like perfect in itself, it's just such a little thrill. So yeah, I really enjoyed all of those books. I recommend them.
What's your not your best? What's
Okay, my
what
go-to cocktail
your go-to? That's what I was looking for.
because it's so simple. It's only two ingredients. Is the Paris Martini. Again,
Mhm.
it's my title. It's not my name. It's not a real thing. It's two parts Bombay dry gin to one part Saint-Germain, which is elderflower liqueur.
Oh, that sounds
And,
like something I would definitely want a bit of.
and I just serve it in a martini glass with the blackberry floating on top.
Oh my God, right, we're all going to Sam's house for cocktails.
You're very welcome if you ever happen to be in the area. I'll
That
definitely.
would be wonderful. Yes, please. It's not where I thought we'd finish this conversation, but I love that. And I also don't think I've ever had a cocktail recommendation from an author before, so that's a new one for the podcast.
Make it part of every show.
I should do, shouldn't I? I really should. If it wasn't already obvious to our listeners, I absolutely loved The Two Loves of Sophie Strom. It is a really beautiful book, and I highly insist that you go and buy yourselves a copy immediately. I'm going to pop a link in the show notes. It is out now, it's published by Faber. It is wonderful, and I'm really excited to explore Sam's back catalogue now. I believe you're also working on a new novel, which is very
Yeah,
exciting.
yeah, I've just finished the second draft of it, so I'm going to reread that in about 6 weeks. I'll send it to my
Amazing.
agent.
Wonderful. I'm so excited for to read more of your work. And where can our listeners find? Are you on social media? Is it just your website that you have?
Yeah, I'm not really on social media. I mean, I'm on Twitter, but I don't post very often. I just tend to kind of repost stuff. I
That's
tend
fair
to
enough.
stay away from social media. Yeah, it feels like a big time suck to me. But
That's
so
totally fair.
also don't update my website very often. I'm not very present in those terms, I'm afraid. Just the books.
Well, they can find you with your books, and that's good enough. Thank you so much, Sam, for joining me today. It's been an absolute joy chatting to you, and you've given me some amazing book recommendations, so thank you.
You're very welcome, and I really enjoyed being on the podcast. Thank you for being so kind about my book as well.
Oh, thank you. As I said, listeners, go and order yourselves a copy. And if you enjoyed this episode, please do rate, review, and subscribe. And if you want to give us a follow, you can do so at A Pair of Bookends Pod on Instagram and at A Pair of Bookends on Twitter and TikTok. And that is all we've got time for. So thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.